Reverend David Carter, stood at the pulpit, his fingers tracing the worn edges of his grandfather's Bible. This leather-bound tome had been passed down through generations of preachers in his family, each adding their own notes and wisdom to its margins. David's neat handwriting filled the spaces between verses, a testament to countless hours spent in study and reflection. At 45, he was an imposing figure. His deep-set eyes, usually bright with passion when he preached, now held a haunted look as he gazed out over the empty church. For how many 15 years, he had led this congregation in San Francisco, guiding them through personal trials and community challenges. He had married countless couples, baptized their kids, and buried their elders. The church was more than just a building to him. It was the heart of the community, a sanctuary where people came to find hope, healing, and belonging. He closed his eyes, trying to center himself through prayer, but the faces of two women kept intruding on his thoughts. Emily, his wife of 15 years, a dedicated nurse who cared for the sick and elderly, and Rachel, his college ex-girlfriend, who had recently reappeared in his life, stirring up old feelings and new complications. David's hand tightened around the Bible, knuckles whitening with the pressure. In his pocket, his phone felt heavy, burdened with a video that could shatter his marriage, his ministry, and maybe even his faith. Little did he know, as he stepped down from the pulpit and headed toward the church doors, that his actions in the coming days would set off a chain reaction that would rock not just his world, but the entire community. The first cracks in David's world appeared on a crisp autumn morning. 6 weeks before that fateful night, the day started like any other. An early rise, a quick breakfast, and a kiss goodbye to Emily before she left for her shift at St. Mary's Hospital. David watched her car disappear around the corner, a frown creasing his brow. Lately, he'd noticed subtle changes in her behavior. She seemed distracted, often lost in thought, and there was a new guardedness about her that he couldn't quite place. Shaking off his unease, David turned his attention to the day ahead. He had a busy schedule, meetings with the church board, counseling sessions, and sermon prep for Sunday. But as he moved through his tasks, a nagging feeling persisted, like a splinter in his mind that he couldn't quite pull out. During his lunch break, the first real seed of doubt was planted. David decided to surprise Emily with lunch at the hospital, something he hadn't done in months. As he approached the nurse's station, he overheard a hushed conversation. "I saw them together again," one voice whispered urgently. "I'm telling you, something's going on." "Shh, you can't just spread rumors like that," another voice admonished, "especially not about Nurse Carter. She's the Reverend's wife." David froze, his heart racing. He wanted to step forward and demand answers, but his feet felt glued to the floor. The conversation continued, oblivious to his presence. "I know what I saw. They were in that little cafe on Market Street, heads close together, looking cozy, and it's not the first time." "Even if that's true, it doesn't mean anything. They could just be friends." "Friends don't look at each other like that. Trust me, there's more to this story." Unable to listen any longer, David retreated, his mind spinning. He left the hospital without seeing Emily, the untouched lunch feeling like a lead weight in his hands. When Emily returned home that evening, David watched her closely. She moved around the kitchen with her usual efficiency, chatting about her day. But now he noticed things he hadn't before. The way she avoided eye contact, the slight tremor in her hands while preparing dinner, the forced cheerfulness in her voice. "How was your day, honey?" Emily asked, setting a plate in front of him. "Did you get a lot done?" David hesitated, torn between confronting her and keeping up the facade of normalcy. In the end, fear of what he might discover held him back. "It was fine," he replied, forcing a smile. "Just the usual." As they ate in strained silence, David's mind raced. Who was this mysterious person Emily had been seen with? What were they to each other? How long had this been going on? As the days passed, David found himself caught in a whirlwind of suspicion, hurt, and anger. He threw himself into his work, spending long hours at the church, partly to avoid confronting Emily, and partly to find comfort in the familiar routines of his ministry. One late night at the church, the past came knocking, literally. "Come in," David called, not looking up from his sermon notes. The door creaked open, and a familiar voice sent a jolt through him. "Hello, David. It's been a long time." David's head snapped up. There stood Rachel, a hesitant smile on her lips. Time had been kind to her. Her dark skin glowed, and her eyes still held that mischievous spark that had drawn David to her all those years ago. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," Rachel said, stepping into the office. "I saw the light on and thought I'd take a chance." David stood, mind racing. "No, you're not interrupting. Please have a seat. What brings you here after all this time?" As they caught up, David couldn't help but be transported back to their college days. They had been young, passionate, and deeply in love. Rachel had been his first serious girlfriend, the woman he thought he would spend his life with. But their paths had diverged. David had felt called to ministry while Rachel pursued a career in law. The breakup had been painful but amicable. "I've moved back to the city," Rachel explained. "I'm joining a law firm here in San Francisco. When I heard you were pastoring this church, I thought I'd stop by and say hello." David nodded, trying to gather his thoughts. "It's good to see you, Rachel. You look well. How have you been?" As they reminisced, David felt a strange mix of nostalgia and unease. Rachel was as charming and intelligent as ever, her laughter filling the office with warmth he hadn't realized he'd been missing. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their lives since college. David opened up about his struggles with the church board, his vision for community outreach, and even his recent doubts about his calling. Rachel listened attentively, offering insights that reminded him why he had fallen for her in the first place. It wasn't until the old clock in the hallway chimed midnight that they realized how much time had passed. "I should be getting home," David agreed, standing up perhaps a bit too quickly. "It was really good to see you, Rachel." As they said their goodbyes, Rachel hesitated at the door. "David, it's been a long time, and we both moved on, but I'd like us to be friends if that's possible. Maybe we could grab coffee sometime." David knew he should say no. Entertaining a friendship with his ex-girlfriend, especially given his suspicions about Emily, felt dangerous. But looking into Rachel's hopeful eyes, he found himself nodding. "Sure, coffee sounds nice. Just as friends, of course." Rachel's smile brightened. "Of course. I'll give you a call next week." As David watched her walk away, he felt a mix of excitement and dread. The return of Rachel Street. James felt like both a blessing and a complication. Little did he know that this chance encounter would set off a series of events that would test his faith, marriage, and identity as a man of God. Driving home that night, David's mind was a jumble of conflicting thoughts. The joy of reconnecting with Rachel clashed with his lingering suspicions about Emily. As he pulled into his driveway, he made a silent vow. He would get to the bottom of whatever was going on with his wife, and he would navigate this unexpected reunion with Rachel carefully. But as David would soon discover, the heart often has plans of its own, plans that can derail even the best intentions. The weeks following David's reunion with Rachel were a whirlwind of emotions and mounting tensions. On the surface, life continued as normal. David led his congregation, counseled parishioners, and maintained the appearance of a happily married man. But beneath that facade, a storm was brewing. David and Rachel began meeting for coffee, their encounters always under the guise of old friends catching up. At first, David justified these meetings as harmless nostalgia, but with each passing week, he found himself looking forward to them with an eagerness that thrilled and terrified him. Rachel was everything Emily wasn't: attentive, engaged, and genuinely fascinated by what David had to say. She laughed at his jokes, offered insightful comments on his sermons, and seemed to understand his struggles in a way no one else did. In her presence, David felt seen and appreciated like never before. Meanwhile, Emily's behavior continued to fuel David's suspicions. She worked longer hours, often coming home late, and her explanations about emergency cases felt hollow. He noticed how she guarded her phone, always keeping it close and angling the screen away from him when texting. One evening, as they sat in tense silence over dinner, David decided to confront her. "Emily," he began, his voice carefully neutral, "is everything okay between us?" Emily looked up, surprise and wariness flashing across her face. "Of course, honey. Why do you ask?" David took a deep breath. "You've been distant lately, working late, always on your phone. I can't help but feel like there's something you're not telling me. For a moment, panic flickered in Emily's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a calm smile. David, you're imagining things. I've just been busy at work. You know how demanding the hospital can be. Her denial only fueled David's suspicions. He wanted to press further, to demand the truth, but something held him back. Maybe it was fear of what he might discover or guilt over his own growing feelings for Rachel. As the days went on, David found himself caught in a web of half-truths and unspoken tensions. He continued to meet Rachel, each encounter leaving him feeling more alive and more conflicted. At home, the distance between him and Emily grew, their conversations becoming superficial and strained. During this tumultuous time, David received an unexpected visitor at the church, Rachel's ex-husband. Mark Thompson, a distinguished cardiologist. His presence sent a ripple of unease through David. "Reverend Carter," Dr. Thompson said, his tone clipped and formal. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." David ushered him into his office, curiosity and apprehension swirling within him. "Not at all, Doctor." "Thompson, what can I do for you?" The doctor's sharp eyes bore into David. "I'll get straight to the point, Reverend. I've heard you've been spending a lot of time with my ex-wife, Rachel." David felt his heart race. "Rachel and I are old friends from college. We've just been catching up." Dr. Thompson's laugh was humorless. "Catching up, is it? Does your wife know about these little meetings?" The implication hung heavily between them. David opened his mouth to respond, but Dr. Thompson cut him off. "I'm not here to judge you, Reverend. The Lord knows Rachel and I had our issues, but I feel obligated to warn you. Rachel has a way of complicating things. She's not the woman you knew in college. Be careful." With those cryptic words, Dr. Thompson left, leaving David reeling. The encounter served as a stark reminder of the dangerous game he was playing. He was a married man, a respected pastor, yet here he was, entertaining feelings for another woman while suspecting his own wife of infidelity. That night, as David lay awake, the weight of his actions pressing down on him, he made a decision. He would end things with Rachel, recommit to his marriage, and confront Emily once and for all. He would put an end to this dance of deception. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Just as David resolved to set things right, events were already in motion that would bring everything crashing down around him in a devastating way. The day that would change everything started like any other. David woke early, his mind heavy with the resolution he'd made the night before. He would end things with Rachel, confront Emily, and try to salvage what was left of his marriage and integrity. As he went through his morning routine, David rehearsed the conversations in his head. He would be firm but kind with Rachel, explaining that their rekindled friendship had crossed a line. With Emily, he would be open and honest about his suspicions. But as the saying goes, the best laid plans often go awry. David's first inkling that something was off came when he arrived at the church to find several missed calls from Deacon Johnson, the head of the church board. The messages were vague but urgent, insisting that David call back as soon as possible. With a growing sense of unease, David dialed the deacon's number. The conversation that followed sent his world spinning. "Reverend Carter," Deacon Johnson's voice was grave. "There's been an incident. A video has been circulating among some members of the congregation. A video involving your wife." David felt his blood run cold. "What kind of video?" he asked, though deep down he already feared the answer. The deacon hesitated. "It's intimate in nature, Reverend, and the man in the video, it's not you." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. Despite his suspicions, he had never truly believed Emily capable of such betrayal. Now, not only was it confirmed, but it was public knowledge, spreading through the congregation like wildfire. "Who is she with?" David managed to choke out. Another painful pause. "It appears to be Dr. Mark Thompson." The name sent David reeling. Dr. Thompson, Rachel's ex-husband, the very man who had warned him about getting too close to Rachel. The irony was almost too much to bear. As the full implications began to sink in, David felt a storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Anger, hurt, betrayal, and shame. His wife had been unfaithful, and with the ex-husband of the woman he had been growing closer to. It was a twist worthy of a soap opera, except this was his life. Reverend, Deacon Johnson's voice cut through David's chaotic thoughts. The board is calling an emergency meeting. We need to discuss how to handle this. In a daze, David made his way to his office, locking the door behind him. He sank into his chair, head in hands, trying to make sense of the chaos that had engulfed his life. Questions raced through his mind. How long had this been going on? How many people had seen the video? What would this mean for his marriage, his ministry, his future? As the shock began to wear off, a new emotion took hold. Cold, calculated anger. David had always prided himself on his ability to forgive, to turn the other cheek. But in this moment, faced with such a public betrayal, forgiveness seemed impossible. Instead, he found himself consumed by thoughts of revenge, not just against Emily and Mark, but against a world that seemed determined to mock his faith and principles. He had tried to do everything right, to be a good husband, a devoted pastor, a pillar of the community. And this was how he was repaid. As he wrestled with his darkest impulses, David's eyes fell on his computer. An idea began to form, terrible and destructive. But in that moment, it felt like the only way to regain control over his shattered life. With trembling hands, David reached for his phone. He had a call to make, to Rachel. If he was going to go down this dark path, he wouldn't do it alone. Who better to understand his pain and desire for retribution than the woman who had been similarly betrayed? As he dialed the number, David knew he was standing on the brink of a decision that would change everything. But in that moment, consumed by hurt and anger, he was beyond caring about the consequences. All he wanted was for those who had wronged him to feel the same pain and humiliation he was experiencing. Little did David know that his actions in the coming hours would set off a chain of events that would not only destroy his marriage and career, but shake the entire community to its core. The stage was set for a scandal of biblical proportions. The next few hours passed in a blur for David. His conversation with Rachel had been brief but intense. She had been shocked by the news of Emily's infidelity with Mark, and the betrayal cut deep for both of them, creating a twisted bond of shared pain and anger. "What are you going to do?" Rachel asked, her voice tight with emotion. David's response was cold and calculated. "I'm going to make them feel what we're feeling. The shame, the humiliation, all of it." There was a pause on the line, and for a moment David thought Rachel might try to talk him out of it. Instead, her voice came back, strong and determined. "Tell me what you need me to do." And so the conspiracy was born. David and Rachel, once young lovers reunited by chance, now found themselves united in a dark purpose. They spent the next few hours planning, their shared desire for revenge overriding any moral qualms they might have had. Rachel proved to be a willing accomplice. She used her legal connections to ensure that their plan wouldn't result in any criminal charges. She also took charge of the technical aspects, making sure the video would play flawlessly when the time came. As evening approached, David stood alone in the empty sanctuary, staring up at the cross that hung above the altar. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Was he really prepared to use the house of God as a stage for his revenge? But then the image of Emily and Mark flashed through his mind, and his resolve hardened. He had given everything to this church, to his marriage, to his faith, and this was how he was repaid. No last-minute change of heart. They would reap what they had sown. The hours ticked by, and soon it was Sunday morning. The church began to fill with parishioners, many casting furtive glances at David as he greeted them at the door. He could see the questions in their eyes, the mix of sympathy and morbid curiosity. As David took his place behind the pulpit, he scanned the congregation. Emily sat in her usual spot in the front row, her face a mask of composure. But David could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her hands twisted nervously in her lap. She knew that he knew, but she had no idea of the reckoning that was about to unfold. David began his sermon as he always did, with a passage from Scripture. But today his words carried a double meaning, laden with the weight of his impending revelation. "Today," he intoned, his voice steady, "we will talk about truth, about how the truth, no matter how painful, must always come to light." As he spoke, David's finger hovered over the remote control hidden behind his Bible. With one press of a button, he would set in motion a chain of events that could change everything. For a brief moment, he hesitated. The faces of his congregation looked up at him, trusting, expectant. They had no idea of the bombshell he was about to drop, the sacred trust he was about to shatter. But then his eyes locked with Emily's, and in that instant, all hesitation vanished. He saw no remorse there, only a weary defensiveness that stoked the fires of his anger. Without further pause, David pressed the button. The large screen behind him, usually used for hymn lyrics and Bible verses, flickered to life. There, in full high-definition clarity, was the video that had torn his world apart. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Gasps of shock rippled through the congregation. Some turned away, unable to watch. Others stared transfixed by the unfolding scandal. Emily, her face a mask of horror, leapt to her feet. Her cry of "No!" was lost in the growing tumult as the video played on. David stood at the pulpit, his face set in grim satisfaction. This was his moment of triumph, his revenge made manifest. Let them all see the truth, he thought. Let them judge. But even as the chaos unfolded, a small voice in the back of David's mind whispered a warning. This was a line crossed, a point of no return. In exposing Emily's sin, he had revealed his own moral bankruptcy. The sanctuary, once a place of peace and worship, had transformed into a scene of chaos. Shouts of anger and disbelief filled the air as parishioners struggled to process what they had just witnessed. As the uproar reached a fever pitch, David realized that his act of revenge had not brought him the satisfaction he had craved. Instead, he felt hollow, drained. In exposing Emily's betrayal, he had destroyed the very fabric of his marriage and his ministry. The fallout was swift. The church board convened emergency meetings, and David was asked to step down. The congregation, once his family, now looked at him with a mix of anger and betrayal. Days turned into weeks, and David found himself isolated and adrift. The church that had been his home for 2 decades was now closed to him. Friends and colleagues avoided him, unsure of how to react to his spectacular fall from grace. He was a pariah in the very community he had served. In the quiet of his empty apartment, David wrestled with his demons. He replayed the events in his mind, questioning every decision. The once vibrant preacher was now a shadow of his former self, plagued by regret and shame. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. One night, as David sat alone, he received an unexpected message. It was from Deacon Johnson. "Can we meet?" it read. Hesitant but desperate for any connection, David agreed. When they met, Deacon Johnson's expression was a mix of disappointment and compassion. "David, I know you're hurting, but you need to understand something. You're not beyond redemption." David looked up, surprised. "How can you say that? I destroyed everything." "No, you made a mistake. We all do, but it doesn't have to define you," the deacon replied. "You need to take responsibility, yes, but you also need to seek forgiveness, not just from others, but from yourself." As the deacon spoke, a flicker of hope ignited within David. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe he could find a way to rebuild, to make amends, and to reclaim his faith. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of determination. Over the next few months, David began the long journey of healing. He reached out to those he had hurt, including Emily, who had moved out and was living with her sister. Their conversations were painful, filled with raw emotions and unspoken truths. David apologized sincerely, acknowledging the hurt he had caused. Emily, while still hurt, began to see the man she had fallen in love with, buried beneath the anger and betrayal. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she admitted one evening, tears in her eyes, "but I appreciate your honesty." David nodded, understanding that forgiveness would take time, if it ever came at all. He focused on rebuilding his life, volunteering at a local shelter, and reconnecting with old friends. He even started attending support groups where he found comfort in sharing his story and hearing others' struggles. As the seasons changed, so did David. He began to rediscover his faith, not as a pastor, but as a man seeking redemption. He learned to embrace vulnerability, to acknowledge his flaws, and to seek help when he needed it. One day, as he sat in a cafe reflecting on his journey, he received a surprising call from Rachel. "Hey, David, I heard about the changes you've been making. I just wanted to check in." Their conversation felt different this time. Lighter, more honest. Rachel had also been on a journey of healing since their last encounter. They talked for hours, reminiscing about the past and sharing their hopes for the future. "I'm proud of you, David," Rachel said, her voice warm. "You're doing the hard work, and it shows." As they hung up, David felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had been through hell and back, but he was finally on the path to healing. He understood that while the scars of his past would always be there, they didn't have to define him. Months later, David stood in front of a different congregation, a small community group he had been invited to speak at. As he shared his story of failure, redemption, and the power of forgiveness, he saw nods of understanding and empathy in the audience. "I've learned that we all stumble," he said, his voice steady, "but it's how we rise that truly matters. I'm not here to preach perfection. I'm here to share my journey and remind you that it's never too late to seek redemption." As he finished, the room erupted in applause. David felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer just a fallen pastor. He was a man who had faced his demons and emerged stronger. In that moment, David realized that while the road ahead would still have its challenges, he was ready to embrace whatever came next. He had learned that true faith wasn't about never falling. It was about having the courage to get back up. Life is a wild ride full of surprises and twists that keep us on our toes. We all know that the truth eventually comes out, no matter how hard we try to hide it. That's why being honest is so important, not just with others, but with ourselves too. It's easy to put on a brave face, but deep down we need to acknowledge our feelings and experiences. Everyone makes mistakes. It's a part of being human. Learning to forgive ourselves and others is key to moving forward in healing. It allows us to let go of the weight we carry and embrace a fresh start. Even when we stumble and fall flat on our faces, there's always a chance to get back up and try again. Life is all about resilience and growth. Remember, our actions don't just affect us, they impact those around us too. So taking responsibility for our choices is crucial. It shows maturity and respect for the people in our lives. During tough times, the support of our friends and community can really lift us up. Having a solid support system can make all the difference, reminding us that we're not alone in our struggles. Nobody's perfect, and accepting our flaws and those of others can help us find peace and understanding. It's all about embracing our imperfections and realizing that they make us who we are. Life is full of opportunities to learn and grow, so let's keep seeking out new experiences and knowledge. Whether it's picking up a new hobby, traveling to a new place, or simply having deep conversations with friends, every moment is a chance to expand our horizons. In the end, love and genuine friendships are what help us get through the hardest challenges. These connections give our lives meaning and remind us of what truly matters. Investing in these relationships is essential because in this journey, we're not alone. We have each other. So let's cherish those bonds, support one another, and navigate this crazy adventure called life together.